A complete redesign is probably one of the worst things that you can do. Welcome to the Treachery of Data podcast, the companion podcast for the CRO Roundtable, a bite sized chunk of content summarizing what was discussed there last week. One of the topics that was brought up by Shirley, one of our regular attendees, was asking about, hey, I'm dealing with some clients or something that want to do like a whole site redesign, throw away everything existing and build a completely new site, and that can be tempting for a lot of different reasons, both good and bad. What has been your experience in dealing with that kind of push when someone's like, hey, we need to redo everything?
So there's a number of reasons why people would want to do redesigns. So that I guess is the first underlying question is why do you want to redesign? And sometimes it's all about the this belief that the website is, I say that belief, but the website is looking stale.
Hmm.
So then we need to freshen it up a little bit. The website looks like it's from the 90s, so you need to freshen it up a little bit or whatever. Another one is like people just want to make it look nicer. I don't like this design. I think
Something new, right?
something new.
Chasing something. Yeah,
Yeah.
whether it's, and that can be both internal and external. External meaning like, or um like a workforce shift, like new people have come in, like maybe there was turnover in the design department, there's a new director of design or something, and they want to leave their mark and be
Yeah.
like, you know, this site wasn't, I wasn't responsible for this one, so I got to build a new one
Yeah.
because that, to show that I have value and that I'm the boss and stuff, which that's a bad idea to do a redesign.
Yes, yes. Another few reasons for doing redesigns. There's like you could do a redesign just because you're changing brand slightly. So there's like a slight brand sort of differences, changes going, or when you're this is which is something you just mentioned before we started the chat. Your company is kind of like shifting a little bit. It's changing from being, a service based to a product based or whatever it is. So
Yeah, there's either a change in scale or a change in direction in like the either the line of service that the company is providing, or you've found like, oh, market A doesn't work for our product, but market B responds well to it instead.
and then there's another reason, which is like a fairly common one, I think, is undergoing or changing the architecture of the site. So
Hmm.
technology architecture.
Shifting
So yeah,
platforms
shifting
or something like
platforms.
that.
So while we're doing that, there's often a thought, why don't we just freshen things up a little bit
We got to
while
build a whole new thing anyway.
yeah.
So
So why don't we make it look nicer? So yeah, and those are all sort of things that I've had
underlying causes of redesigns.
underlying causes of redesigns. I think it's important to note before going into the all these strategies that we could employ to kind of mitigate the risks. Because yes, I've been involved in or I've witnessed many of big sort of redesigns where it's just been horrible. And I've never seen one when it's not been tested that it's gone well. So by, even if there's loads and loads of user testing done, if there's been no A/B testing done in order to transition from one to another, it always ends up badly. So
What what do you think the reason for that is? Because if you're making the case of like, well, like the design team or whoever, like did a bunch of usability testing on their mock-ups and user research and stuff, like, and everything, all that pre-research informed the design, which that's all great stuff to do. You know,
Yeah,
we're
yeah,
not saying,
it's
oh,
all
don't
great.
do that, right?
Yeah.
You know, you know, um, what do you think where's the gap there in sort of like theory versus execution?
So in terms of like one of the past sort of sites where that's kind of happened, I mean, I guess it kind of depends on the size and scale of the website.
Sure, sure, sure.
So
There's not going to
there's
be one single answer here, but
yeah, so there's so many nuances involved that, you know, when you do user testing just is a one is a small sample size that you're testing on. And two, what you're doing is you're getting qualitative feedback, like you know, you're observing people in not their natural environment, and you're giving them a very, very clean set of tasks and stuff. So then when you then shift it to the real world, there's you know there's so it's so much noisier, and so user testing definitely is valuable to kind of if you're asking for specific questions and you need to get specific insights before before doing a technical change, but that technical change always needs to be A/B tested because that technical change, the execution, you know, there'll be nuances there that haven't been taken into consideration during the user testing with the sample size that you've got and with the noise and everything
so
that goes along with it.
typically like that pre-research is an issue of scale, where it's like you're you're not getting enough data on variety of users. Like if you really wanted to do that, you'd have to do usability testing thousands of times over, which isn't a sustainable
Yeah,
practice,
exactly.
right? You would
Yeah.
take you months to do that level of
Yes.
user testing.
And again, it's kind of different for different cases. So say you've
Hmm.
got a website that is complete pants. Then then you do
I've
user
never heard
test.
that term before.
That's a British term. It
Oh,
just means
okay.
it's completely rubbish. Um, so, and then if you and you've done the usability testing on this site, and the users are telling you, "Oh, this is pants. I don't know how to work this. I'm out of here." Um,
You're talking about the current site,
Current site, yeah,
like
yeah.
you've done research on the current site, and everything points towards like this site is just garbage. Like
This site is
it's bad.
garbage.
It misses the point.
Ye-
It's the usability is poor, right? There's
yeah,
just like every possible issue
yeah,
is
and it's rare, but it could happen at early stages of a of like a company starting up with the website completely missing its mark in terms of what it's even like goals and what it's supposed to be doing. So it's all based on like what are the goals of the website
the
and
old
what are the metrics
the
and
old company owner's nephew special.
yes, yes. Yeah, exactly. And it's just like, okay, what's this picture of an excavator and cranes doing here? Isn't this supposed to be a financial?
Yeah.
Um,
But the site's under construction.
the site's under construction. So I've been there as well. Like
Yeah.
there's site where it's kind of like they're a credit card or sort of related to credit cards and stuff. And the website, the main image and everything was all cranes and things working and stuff like that. And nobody everybody was so scared about, raising it to the C-suite level. So there are situations like that that it could happen, in which case, you probably do need to start with a brand new redesign, user testing, and it's more likely that user testing will work out better even if you don't do A/B testing.
Yeah.
But it's all on a case by case basis.
Right. Yeah. So different so we're actually like starting off here with like making the case for why redesigns are actually okay, because we don't want to just completely dump on them,
Yeah,
right?
don't completely poo poo the
The
idea.
idea of a redesign.
And
Yeah.
also there's ways of like because redesigns are necessary,
Yeah.
because and
There's a reason that you want to do the redesign,
yeah,
and like you want to get from point A to point B, but doing a redesign isn't necessarily the best path to
doing a
travel.
redesign without without doing any sort of preparatory, any sort of A/B testing, just doing the old switcheroo, the old Indiana Jones idol with the sack of the sand sort of switch. You don't do that. So which is
Yeah,
what we're saying,
yeah,
which is
yeah.
why we're gonna
In
talk about
in general,
strategies.
don't do that. Yeah,
In
yeah, yeah,
general,
yeah,
don't
yeah.
do that. Yeah.
Are there any other reasons that like doing a complete redesign might actually be a good idea?
I think you mentioned one, which was like if the company does a complete pivot to
Yeah,
something entirely different.
yeah.
In which
Well,
case,
that like that's just such like a business transformative thing that it like
yeah,
necessitates like it's basically like making the entire previous website inaccurate and moot,
yeah,
right? Like it's no longer relevant. So by that very like core nature, you need to do a complete.
because it's all based on the goals and the what the metrics are that are being tracked on the website. So if the goal of the website, if the core goal doesn't exist currently on the old website, and the new website needs to have a brand new set of goals, brand new set of metrics
Mhm.
that are currently not catered for on the current website, then yes, you need to do the old switcheroo sort of thing.
Yeah, a couple other reasons, and these are more fuzzy because these are starting
Mm,
to get into things where it's like, okay, some of these would be also be valid reasons for like testing into them as well, and a lot of them are associated with like technology aspects of the site. You know, two design ones would be like unifying a fragmented design, meaning like, as the company was growing, you were standing up different landing pages and they were all outsourced to different designers and stuff. So there's no like unified brand cohesiveness to the
mm,
design of different areas of the website. Or like maybe like this department is in charge of this section of the website because that's for them. This other department is in charge of another area of the website, right? And they have completely different designs, color schemes, like um UI components, like oh their notification boxes look different and all of these different like unifying a fragmented design is probably a good case for a redesign. Now you might want to test like which unified design performs better and things like that. But yeah, that's probably a good
mm.
argument for it. Or like shifts in general design awareness.
Mm.
So like design methodologies. A good example of this would be the rise of responsive sites. Like when I first started building websites ages ago in the early 2000s, responsiveness wasn't a thing that existed, right? You built a website and over time people started to think like, okay, this particular width is the best width for a website. And then as monitors got bigger, and then as phones became introduced, you saw this need for like, oh, like, do we start building different websites for different, like some companies had like m.domain.com for their mobile website or something, and they were actually maintaining two different websites, right? And that became an tenable solution because you're trying to manage two different things using the same data backend and blah blah blah. So that gave rise to like responsive designs, and um, that played a factor in SEO as well at some point of like, hey, your site should be accommodating to all these different user types, and if it's not, we're going to penalize you in search rankings, right? So that would be a case for okay, a read like the result of the redesign is so important that it's something that we need to do.
Yeah. So
You
let's
know,
get into like saying assuming that we are doing a redesign, strategies for doing that redesign, that is going to be safe and you're going to minimize the risk of doing that. So I think Jordan mentioned booking.com. One thing that they do think is kind of, which is interesting, the idea um, of having a net neutral outcome. And, so basically and they basically, what they have is like, if they want to go from one state of the website to this brand new state of this redesign website, then they break it into assumptions and they test along the a path to this new state. And if there's any tests that are negative, then they'll be looking for anything that would be a positive that kind of neutrals makes it balances it out. And as long as everything is all net neutral, because it's what we're basically saying is we're it's a non-inferiority test is what we're doing. We're going from one state to another.
Yeah,
So as long
exactly.
as overall it's a not it passes the non-inferiority checks, then it's all good.
Well, so you kind of mentioned two things there. One is first applying experimentation to your redesign to at least make
Yes.
sure that the new design is not worse than the old site, right? Like that's the benchmark that you want to clear. You want to make sure that you're not um, um, making any important metric performance worse than
Mhm.
what it previously was,
Yeah.
or if something is worse then it's acceptable. Like maybe you're like, oh, we're okay with lowering order volume overall because that means less like warehouse overhead if we're getting like a higher AOV or something like that, or right. So there's potentially some trade-offs that you would evaluate there, but that's par for the course for any experimentation program.
Yeah, and actually, there's probably like even at a more kind of going a step back, there's probably two sort of approaches that a company has to take in order to go over to the redesign. There's one which is like, okay, we're going to keep our same technology stack, and we just want to do a redesign, freshen the site up, versus, hey, we're going to the entire the technical architecture of our site is changing, and then for that, it's necessary to do some redesigns. So then so I
Yeah,
think
there's
the
two
approach
things
is,
there. Yeah.
yeah, there's two
Yeah.
things there. So what we're first talking about is like, okay, so the architecture of the site remains the same. We're just doing a freshen up, and these are some of the ways that you could do that. So sorry, you were saying about what the other thing?
No, the other thing you mentioned was breaking it up into phases,
Yes.
which that's a fairly obvious strategic approach of like rather than trying to uh, there's a common analogy that I've heard, right? Like how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time, right?
Nice.
It's a huge task, but you can't just swallow the elephant
Yeah.
whole. You have to break it up into chunks. So same thing with a redesign. Like instead of being like, this is how our site looks, this is how we want it to look, we're gonna do that whole thing all at once, break it up into stages or phases. Now the question there is, well, how do you actually break it up? Because like you think about it, like it'd be silly if like you break it up into um like page types. Like you can't do something where it's like, okay, we'll just redesign the homepage and then we'll just redesign the product page and then we'll just redesign, like that's valid for experimentation if you're making small iterative changes, but for a redesign that wouldn't necessarily make sense because like if your redesign also involves changing like how your navigation looks and maybe like the organization of the navigation, well, you don't want to present the navigation one way on some pages and then a different way on other pages, right? You want to present a cohesive piece. So you have to break like to the way to break a redesign up is to break it up into design based elements of like, okay, if we're going to change the way our navigation looks, then change the way the navigation looks. Like test that aspect of it. If you're going to change like organization of the navigation, keep your current the way the navigation's currently designed, fit in the new organization as best you can, right? Like you're breaking things up. Um, if you're doing like a branding redesign and that necessitates like changing colors and things like that, change just that element of the site while keeping it as cohesively, analogous as you can from a UI standpoint with the previous design.
Yeah, and there's probably I'd add to that a few sort of things where if you if there are some assumptions that are laid into why certain things are being changed, and every site is going to be different, right? So say for example you've got specific components or modules or areas of the site, like a timetable results page, the way that timetable results are shown, and all that kind of stuff. Then if there's stuff that can be broken into assumptions, and if those assumptions can be done as a single test, then you could break it you could break it that way. Another thing is it all depends on how quickly you can move. So sometimes it's like if you've got a global style sheet and hey, I can do the whole redesign with a global style sheet change. It's only going to take me like a couple of days to do. Then yeah, just do one big redesign and then just A/B test into that. Otherwise, you break it down into what is going to be cheap to develop into, as in terms of what you were trying to do is mitigate the risk of spending all of this time on something that's going to be negative. So then mitigate it by breaking down, okay, this is going to take me a few days and this makes sense as a chunk to release separately. Then you can do that bit, test it, that works fine, release that, that's your new base, and then move on to the next chunk. So like you're saying, the size of the chunks of the elephant, depending on the size of the elephant,
Hmm.
it could be like I mean, to get really valuable, but baby elephants and stuff like that would be easier to
How about pygmy elephant?
pygmy. Yes, pygmy elephants would be
Or is
easier.
that even I don't know if that's an
Yeah,
okay
yeah, they
term or
could be
not.
endangered species, so I wouldn't want to go there, offend anyone. Um,
You're stretching the analogy towards
yes,
making point.
but yeah, but basically, depending on how you chunk it, is how to reduce the risk essentially of
And
going
that's going
over
to
to
be
the
on a case by case
yeah,
basis, right?
yeah,
Like there's no one a website is a complex thing, so the answers are going to have to be specific to the level of complexity and what your site is doing.
yeah,
Like a site that's just a bunch of single landing pages that have a focused audience, that's going to be much easier to break up than say like an e-commerce site where lots more of the UI is interconnected.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And so, yeah, and what you could see is, certain pages are performing better, certain pages are performing worse when you go to this new cohesive design. So you might need to factor in that there's going to be some iterations that need to be done in order to get it to a net neutral, if that's what you're like, what you're going for. Um, but yeah, the other the other one, which is actually a really tricky one, which is a technical architecture shift, where especially a big one going from old multi-page website layout to a single page application. And it gets pretty complicated pretty quick at that stage. Um,
Yeah, there's from a technology standpoint because there's like in your example of like going from static to a React site, right? That's a massive technology shift, you know. It could also be something like migrating from one platform backend to another that both like serve the site in a similar fashion, but with that, there's all of these little things when you're migrating that fall through the cracks,
yes.
you know. Um, and something that may seemingly be unimportant, like like, "Oh, this shifted the font size larger." Well, that really should that's something that's really solvable by CSS, so maybe that's a bad example, but, something seemingly as small as that could potentially have a large effect, and so when
Yeah.
you're doing a resign, you wanna make sure, like or look when you're doing a migration, if you're not also attaching a redesign to that, you wanna make sure there's parity as best as you possibly can.
Yeah. And in fact, what in the scenario that uh, I was talking about when we tackled that in the other company, which I'm trying not to name companies here. Um, But in that, what we did was we had weekly sessions with the developers where we said, okay, sure, the goal of the overall goal is when we're moving from a static multi-page site to a single page application, is that the UI looks the same. Uh, the UI looks the same. So then what we do is then we would have weekly check-ins with the developers, and the developers would always say, "Hey, I've finished this page, and it looks exactly the same as the current page." And I go, "Okay, great. Let's bring them up side by side." And you always pick out loads and loads of differences, and some of the differences are very, very subtle, or could be very, very subtle. Some of the differences could be pretty major. Now, there's like
Are you
on
expecting pixel perfection?
for that particular company with the sheer amount of traffic they've got, and knowing the from previous testing that changing some pixels here and there can have like a measurable impact. Yes, we're going for pixel perfect accuracy, or as close to pixel perfect accuracy as we can. So yeah, we do these checks and we check okay, yeah, these are the list of things that we need to do. If there are stuff that have to change because React components work in a different way, there are certain components that we can't build into the new site for whatever, we'd note them down as differences, which we can then test in the original website. And
Yeah, that's a good like if you're doing a comparison and you see like this is something that's going to definitely change as a result of technology change on the new site, we can try and replicate that on the old site and test it to see if it will have an impact. If it doesn't, okay, great, fine. If it does, we need is it acceptable? If it's not, we need to find a way to mitigate that.
yeah, exactly. And then we'd have a list of all of those things, and there'd be certain things that we know there's a negative impact, and so then we say, okay, bank that or note that down somewhere. There's no way to avoid that. We're going to have this negative impact. And so that we're well aware what we're getting into ahead of this redesign.
Yeah. So most of the stuff we've been talking about so far has been like the visual components of doing a redesign, which yes, I mean that's the reason you do a redesign, right? But there's a hidden factor there as well of like when you're changing things, your that may also affect the data that's being collected as well, especially if you're doing like
Yep.
like a technology or a platform shift or something as well. You have to also maintain all of the little invisible connections of how you're collecting data on the website too.
Yeah. And that was a huge concern, especially going from multi-page site to a
Right.
single page
I
application.
right, a React site doesn't
Yeah.
have discrete like
Pages.
page views as traditionally like event triggered by a web browser, right?
Yeah.
And this is one of the reasons that like GA Universal Analytics is moving to all being entirely event based with GA4, right? So
Yeah. And so you'd have these conversations about what is a page? What really is this a page? Are we going to call this a page, or are we going to call this a page? And all that kind of stuff. And even with the metrics, if you're trying to compare like the funnel of multi-page application to a single page application, they're going to look different because of the way that the metrics are being collected are different.
yeah, it might that might also facilitate a data analysis redesign in a sense of like how we're collecting data from the website changes. So we have to change the way that we're interpreting the data as
Well, this
well.
is this is the other thing, because what we found was when we were moving, it's not just like you were saying, it's not just the analysts, not just the designers who uh, wanted things to be changed. It's not just the developers who wanted things to change. It'd be the analysts who wanted to change the way the metrics are collected. So what I ended up doing at this place was setting up a secondary set of metrics to try and, as accurately as possible, replicate the original set of metrics. And actually, what we found, it was a good thing that we did that. What we found is like one set of metrics was leaning towards one way. Hey, this is a massive loss. Whereas the actual other metrics were showing, oh, okay, this is actually showing this way. And between the two, we can figure out, okay, this is why we're seeing this discrepancy in terms of the behavioral change. What we're seeing is behavioral changes aren't actually behavioral changes. And then one other thing Jordan pointed out, and he was absolutely right to point out, is overall what you're worried about is a pile of money that each sort of variant gives you at the end in terms of conversions, in terms of revenue. What's the revenue for A? What's the revenue for B? Are they broadly the same?
Yeah. Yeah, because if you spend, $500,000 doing a site redesign and it tanks your revenue by 5%, you've just spent a bunch of money to make less money,
Yeah, exactly. Which is very
which
often the
is the
case.
worst. Well, that's like the worst outcome of
Yes.
doing a redesign.
Yeah. And it's and it can be quite quite tricky with like, for example, with this approach where we're basically saying, hey, designers, hold off on doing redesigns. We'll change the technical architecture first and then make sure the design looks the same, and then your redesign will come as a secondary thing on top after we've shifted over to this new platform. Then we A/B test the redesign. And so, yeah, it just involves a lot of like making a lot of difficult
But
decisions.
what is the design department gonna do in the meantime? They're just gonna sit there and twiddle their thumbs while collecting a paycheck.
Yeah. Well, then what they're going to do is ensure that two pages are exactly the same. They're going to use the critical design eye to kind of like say, yep, this is a case. This is what's up.
Designers don't just design, right? They can also be engaged in research and all
Yes,
that
exactly. UX
other
and all.
aspects of, not just the wireframing and mock-up output.
Yes.
All right. So, in summary, redesigns are something that you have to be very cautious about. A, you need to be going in for the right reasons to be wanting to do the redesign. B, it's a good idea to try and break it up into stages commensurate with the reasons behind your redesign. And C, don't stop doing testing while you're in the process of doing redesign work. Like, let your experimentation inform how you're doing the redesign, whether that's, trying to ensure parity and finding out if, irreconcilable differences are okay, or testing, testing the redesign at each separate stage. Did I miss anything there?
Yeah. I mean, no. It's all about risk mitigation at the end of the day. So your strategy is going to be all about
Applying the principles
mitigating.
of risk mitigation from experimentation to
Yeah.
a redesign
And
project.
we're going to use A/B testing. We're going to use user testing. We're going to use user research, all of those tools, but they now get applied as a risk mitigation to move to this new design. Now, unless like there's probably a view that some people probably be saying, "Hey, but my redesign is going to be much better." I'm actually thinking the redesign is going to perform better. Well, then it just, I think the principles remain the same. You're going for de-risk. Any sort of wins will just be a bonus.
All right. Well, if you have any questions or feedback, you can always talk to me and Iqbal face to face every week at CRO Roundtable. at conversionworld.co. If you're shy or you don't like speaking, you can always connect with us on LinkedIn as well. Thanks for listening. We will catch you next time.